Hello students, welcome to lab number 5. In the last lab we covered the final few tools that you're going to need to do good data analysis. So we covered pivoting and merging, and I meant it when I said that with those tools you have pretty much everything you need to accomplish anything that you want in R or anything that you could possibly want to do in this class or for your final presentation. And moreover, with that suite of tools, you can, confidently say that I'm capable of data analysis in R through the full range of things. And to kind of prove that, we went through the workflow a little bit of an R data analysis project in the last homework assignment. So hopefully you found that to be a little less intense than assignment 2. Assignment 3 was a little bit easier. And now we can finally move into things that aren't kind of technical, learning the nitty-gritty details of R and dplyr, and move into some other things. Not because you're already experts in dplyr, I mean, neither am I, but really the rest of those skills are just going to come with practice. And so I think it's worthwhile to move into other topics related to data science, data analysis, political statistics, and stuff like that. So today we're going to learn R Markdown. And R Markdown is kind of a solution to the problem of getting your analysis out of R. So far in your assignments, I've asked you to just submit the scripts that you've written. I run them myself, and then I look at your output in RStudio to see whether what you've created is worthwhile or not worthwhile. But most of the time, you're going to be needing to submit things in like a paper format, right? If you are in college, you're going to write many papers, and most of you probably do that in like Word or some other word processing software, Google Sheets or LibreOffice, whatever it is. You're not doing it in R. And so that poses a problem, which is to say I wrote all this awesome R code and I'm making all of these nice ggplot plots, but I have to do this really kind of primitive right-click save as on my cool charts, or I have to export them and they don't look as cool, and I have to tab between 3 different programs to make it happen. R Markdown is a solution to that problem. And in fact, it's so powerful because it can create not only documents like PDFs, but also presentations. So to give you an example of how useful R and R Markdown are, all of the materials in this class, with the exception of these videos, have been created in R Markdown. So all of the slides you watch that I've uploaded, the HTML slides, all of the homework prompts, all of those created in R. In addition to all of the scripts that I've made in kind of files that you haven't seen, I would say 80% of the workload of this class was done in R using R Markdown. So it's a terrific tool. And like I said, kind of the first thing I want to cover in this lab is why are we already moving out of topics like correlation and stuff like that in our labs, and why are we already moving on to things like R Markdown? And that's honestly because presentation matters, and for 3 reasons. First off, kind of the most frequent refrain you will hear from your boss, from professors, from your peers, when you show them some finding or some pattern that you found in the data, one of the most common refrains is, "I'm not convinced." Right? Just plain and simple. They're just going to say, "I know you ran your statistical tests. I know that you told me that they are statistically significant, but for numerous theoretical reasons, or because your presentation just wasn't that convincing, I'm just not convinced." And that really, I think, can be frustrating to some degree, because at first you want to say, well, but I ran the test, it's statistically significant. But really, they have a point in that you haven't made the case that you have rigorously explored this phenomena and pattern that you found and presented it to people in a compelling way. So that's kind of ties into the reason why we don't focus so heavily on things like p-values and t-tests and statistical significance in this class, and we focus almost exclusively on things like summary statistics and visualizations, because those things convince people when they're well crafted. And moreover, it gives you a more nuanced understanding of not only your data, but your theory. And so when you present your findings, when you present your data and your theory, it should be visually arresting and visually compelling to other people who haven't spent several hours noodling around in your data set like you have. And doing so also helps answer that question, so what? In all of your research, you're going to have to answer the so what question, right? Okay, you found that X variable is correlated with Y variable, so what? Why should I care, right? Here's your opportunity to show them why they should care by putting it in a very compelling looking report. And lastly, rigor and presentation are essentially the part of the same process. So you can run all of the statistical tests in the world, but if you don't present them in an interesting and compelling way, it doesn't really matter. Likewise, we're focusing on summary statistics because you can have the most beautiful bar chart in the world, but if it isn't backed up by some interesting summary statistics or rigor, then it doesn't really mean anything. So back to what we're doing today. Let's say we covered all these things. Thank you for listening to my rant about that. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Actually, why don't we just delete this? We don't need that. And so today we're going to start with a totally fresh install of R and R Studio, because R Markdown, the first time you run it, can be a little bit of a pain to get configured, and it can be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around. And so I want to start from as fresh a slate as possible, and we'll run into any technical problems that we do together. We'll handle them, and then we'll see kind of what the output is. So the only things I've downloaded so far are a fresh copy of R, a fresh copy of R Studio, and then these three libraries, dplyr, tidyr, and ggplot, which we've used in most of our labs, and the R tools package. And I'll link to that in the assignment, so you can download R tools too, which might be useful or not, I'm not sure, but it's always helpful to have installed. So why don't we get started, and let's open a new file, but instead of opening an R script, let's open an R Markdown script. And so when we do that, we're prompted with this additional kind of little prompt here. And so I'm gonna call this my lab, I think this is lab 5 assignment. And the author, I'm just going to say, is me, and this. And then it'll ask you, what do you want your output format to be like? And here's where things already kind of get exciting, right? Because we all know PDF and Word, right? Surprise, R can produce Word documents, which is pretty nice if you really like Word. But more interestingly, especially as we get into later material that has interactive charts, we're doing that in our last lab, look forward to that. We can also, if we want to do that, it has to be an HTML format. That is, kind of any browser can open up this file. So why don't we do that? Instead of a PDF, why don't we open it up as an HTML file? And when you do that, you're going to get kind of all of this extra stuff. And why don't I delete everything down from line 21 downwards? And then I'm going to start at the basics. The top of your R, so just to set the scene, what we're doing here is we're just creating kind of the skeleton of a document. And R is going to take that skeleton, and it can make it into a number of different formats. So kind of the reason people often cite for using Markdown in general and R Markdown specifically is that one benefit is that you can embed your code right into your document, number one. And the other benefit is that you spend less time thinking about the format of your document and more time thinking about the content of your document. What is it that I'm writing about? I don't want to spend all of my time thinking about fonts and other things like that. That's just kind of irrelevant to what it is that we're doing here. So that's the impetus for using R Markdown, right? And you'll notice a few things right at the top in between these three this pair of 3 dashed lines right here. We have our title, colon, and that thing that we typed in the first time. We have author, has my name, just like I typed in, and today's date, which is 9/2. That's when I'm making this. And then it also has an additional key value pair that's going to tell R when it's turning this skeleton into some document. Hey, turn this into an HTML document. If I want it in PDF format, this would be different, and we'll show you how to do that a little bit later on. Terrific. So we're getting started. This part of the document is called the YAML, Y-A-M-L. So that's what we're covering right now, the YAML. Let's go ahead and move this to the top. It's kind of an important part. So this is the YAML, right? This is the YAML. This tells R Markdown, hey, here's some important values that you're going to need to know when you turn this into a document, things like title, author, date, etc. And it's going to put these at the top of all of my documents, regardless of how I decide to, whatever output I want. And it's going to say, this is the output you should do it to when you finally turn this skeleton into like a body of a document. Okay, the next thing that we need to know, I'm just going to delete everything that's irrelevant. And I'm going to write, this is test text. And I'm going to save my document. Test Markdown. Okay. So R Markdown is very useful for organizing the stuff that you're doing analysis on. So when you write any report, often what you'll find is that you'll write 3 or 4 paragraphs of text. Then you're going to want to show a chart. Then you're going to write 3 or 4 more paragraphs of text, and then you're going to want to show a chart. And then when you're done with that section, for example, let's say you've finished your literature review. So let's go ahead and start off and say literature review. And we say, okay, this is my literature review section. It starts with 2 pound signs in a row, then a space, and then I'm going to say whatever the name of this section is, right? This is not R code. You can just treat this as kind of a text editor, like you're writing in Notepad, for example, right? And when I put this into an actual document, when I knit it into an actual document, that's the verb we use, knitting. When we knit it into a document, this is going to be one of the headers of my document. So why don't we go ahead and knit this for the first time and see what it looks like as an HTML output. It's not going to be very exciting because we haven't really done much so far, but that's okay, right? And so I have an HTML page here that has kind of those values I first put up there, and then it has my header literature review and my test text right here. Right? Okay, nothing too exciting right now, but then let's say I want to do something like data munging. And I'm going to say, these are the steps that I took to munge my data. And now I'm going to say, 1, I loaded it. 2, I changed column names. 3, I fixed typos. 4, I centered and standardized. 5, that's it, just 4 actually, right? I want a numbered list here. And you know, you might intuitively think, well, yeah, that looks like a numbered list. Let's go ahead and knit this and see what it looks like. Yeah, right? And R kind of does the nice work of indenting that for us. It puts it kind of on a different indent. So I haven't spent any time thinking about, oh, what do I want my ordered list to look like? What do I want my numbered list to look like? I just type it out and I say, you know what, R, you figure it out. I'm not interested in spending any mental energy clicking the numbered list button in Microsoft Word, for example. You do all that work. And it's starting to kind of come together, right? So I have 2 sections here. I've made my data munging section. I've made my literature review section. Terrific. Now maybe I have my findings section. I'm going to say these are my findings. X variable is very spread out. The mean is X. The standard deviation is Y, right? And let's say these are kind of going to be my only sections that I have for some hypothetical paper that I'm writing. Okay, so far, the utility of R Markdown is not exactly apparent. It's not really clear to me why I would do this instead of just using Word, for example. Why wouldn't I just open up Word? It's just as many steps. Here's where things start to get exciting. You may have noticed this weird little gray block up here, right? This is called a chunk. It's called a chunk. Let's keep this for now. This is called a chunk. And here is where I can execute some code. And I like executing code because when I execute code, I do very nifty things like make nice looking charts. I can run statistics like the correlation, or I can fit linear models, for example, right? And so the first chunk is going to be your setup chunk. So why don't we add our first chunk first, actually? So in this module, we have our data. This is the same data that we're going to use for the next lecture. So why don't we get a little bit familiar with it so that by the time we're talking about correlation and things like that, you have a little bit better of a familiarity with how these variables vary and other things like that. Let's say I want a chunk down here that's going to calculate or just visualize something, right? I want to actually make use of the tools that come with R Markdown. I'm going to go up here to this C, insert a new code chunk. And right at the top, you'll notice that there is R, but that there's also all sorts of other languages that I can insert. Now, you haven't learned any of these languages in this course, but if you're familiar with D3 or Python, for example, D3 JavaScript, which is a different visualization library in JavaScript, Python, which is another very popular data analysis language, you can execute that code in this document as well. But since all we really know is R for now on, or for now anyway, we're just gonna do it in R. And so there we go, we've inserted a chunk. But now I need to do something with this chunk. I want to execute some R code. So what I like to do is I like to open up an R script that I test my code in before putting it in a chunk. So why don't I, do the classic things that I always do, library dplyr, library ggplot, and library tidyr, right? Okay, we've loaded our three libraries. Why don't we go ahead and say lab5 script. Okie doke. So I know I'm going to need those three libraries because I almost always use those three libraries. And so why don't we go ahead and read in our data set. Oh, whoops. Close that first, and then I'll just open up my lab5 script. And my directory is kind of set for me. Remember, when you open it up from the directory, it automatically sets that location as your working directory. So why don't I load all my libraries again, and yep, my data works, right? Or I'm sorry, my code works, it's reading it in. So I'm just gonna do that. Let's go back to our Markdown document, and I'm gonna say, please read in my data. And then I want you to show me the top 6 rows of my data. That's it, head. That's what the head command does. So why don't I knit that now and see what I get. So it's going to take a little bit to turn it into an HTML format. And would you look at that? It just prints the top 6 right into my HTML file right away, right? There are a few interesting things that kind of show up. One, I don't know that I actually want it to show my code, right? So, you know, it's nice that this code is here. That's my chunk, but all I really want it to show is my output. That's it. I just want to see this table right here. And so one command in these curly brackets, when you open up your chunk, there are a few things to keep in mind. One, this says R because unsurprisingly, we are using the R language, but we can pass multiple commands to R that will let it know, hey, here's how I want you to deal with this data or whatever, or deal with this code. One of those is called echo. And echo, if I just type in these things, it'll kind of automatically give me options. And I want to say false. So what echo does, let's save that and let's rerun it. What echo does is you'll notice no more code any longer. It's not printing out my code, right? All it's printing out are my results. And so maybe I just want to see how this runs on its own before I knit it. You know, by the time you get to creating these kind of longer documents, you're going to have a lot of text and a lot of chunks of code running. Maybe I don't want to run the whole thing. Maybe I just want to run this part to see if it works. And so I can just press this little play button right here, and it'll only run this chunk, which is very useful for finding errors. So let's put on our data analyst hat here for a second. And let's say, okay, you know, this X column, it just looks like it's duplicating row names. So why don't I minus select that, right? I don't want this column. And let's go ahead and rerun this and see what we get. Okay, great, right? We got rid of that column. Let's go ahead and try and re-knit this to see what our document looks like. Could not find the function the pipe. That's interesting. And the reason it can't find the pipe is because while I have called my libraries here in a different script, I haven't called them here in my R Markdown script. So you can think of it as when R is turning this skeleton into an actual document, that it kind of starts its own brand new R instance, and it looks for all those libraries and it does everything basically from scratch. So we've been ignoring this chunk up here, but it's very important to pay attention to. So you'll notice that this chunk has a name. It's called setup, and it's R code. The interesting thing about this setup chunk is that anything you do in the setup chunk carries over into every other chunk. So, for example, that's perfect for things like calling libraries. So library dplyr, library ggplot2, and library tidyr. We're going to ignore that last line for now, right? So this is in our setup chunk. So the very first thing it does before it looks at any material, and this time it worked, right? We're not getting kind of the row names here the way we did last time. And so it understood that, hey, load your libraries before you do anything in the setup chunk. And then this worked, right? So, you know what, I'm not even sure we need to do that. So here's an interesting thing too, right? Anything that it happens in the setup chunk carries over for the rest of the R Markdown document. Well, I probably plan to use this data in more areas than just this one chunk. And let me kind of make this point a little bit clearer. I'm going to say echo equals false for the next one. And maybe I want to do something like, what's the mean of data GDP per capita NARM equals true. And so this last argument is to say that, some countries are probably missing some values. They're probably NA values. And so when you calculate the mean of this variable, just ignore the NA values. That's what I want you to do. That's what NARM equals true means. It means remove the NAs, right? So, and again, echo equals false. I don't want to see this code. I just want to see the output of this code. And so we read in data here, right? And then we reference data here. But they're in two different chunks. So let's go ahead and try and knit that and see what happens. All right, so I guess that does work. So it used to be that way, but it can be, well, actually, why don't we try doing it this way? Alrighty, well shoot, I guess things have changed since the last time I used R Markdown, so I guess some things do carry over between chunks. But even so, a kind of useful way to do things is that if I'm going to have to repeat myself multiple times, it's often useful to just put my data call here in this setup chunk, right? That way, the kind of things that are going to carry over throughout my document are here right at the beginning, right? Kind of in the same way that for our other scripts, we've done all of our data munging first, and then we keep referencing the data document. I want to do the same thing here. Now this way, my chunks look a lot less cluttered, for example. They look much nicer. And I can say, okay, well, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and I'm just referencing the same object that I loaded in my setup chunk. Okay, and so far, all I've really done is kind of basic commands, but we know that we can do a lot more interesting stuff than that. So why don't we try to do something more interesting than that? Why don't we make a few visualizations, for example? So let's take a look at my data and say, okay, why don't I select 2 or 3 variables here? So I'm going to say select minus x select minus x. Why don't I get rid of this for now? And let's read in our data and see what we get. Yep, that's kind of what we were used to. And let's pick 2 different variables. These are variables that you'll become very familiar with in the next module, in the next lecture, when we dive into this data set a little bit more. Why don't we pick infant mortality and GDP per capita. Oops, and I definitely want country name as well, but I don't remember what the name of that column was. So let's see, it was called country. Okay, great. So I want country, infant mortality, and GDP per capita. Okie doke, right? These are some big numbers right here. So why don't I do something simple, make it a little bit easier? I kind of want to see what the relationship between these 2 variables is. So why don't I save this to an object? And again, remember, this is in a separate script. I'm just doing things here to make sure that they kind of work before I decide that I actually want to do this in my R Markdown. And why don't I just do a basic ggplot kind of scatter plot? Since I have 2 variables, I'll just do a scatter plot. So on X, maybe I want GDP per capita, and on Y, I want the infant mortality rate. And then since I want a scatter plot, I'm going to do geom point. Let's go ahead and run that and see what we get. Okay, so interesting looking. We'll deal with this very strange kind of looking distribution and its implications in the next lecture, but this is serviceable at the very least. And so remember, ggplot will give you a warning sometimes if it omitted values, and in this case, it did omit values, right? So it said, hey, there are missing values in 31 rows, and we look through our data set and we say, yeah, there wasn't any data here. You can't draw a point if you only know one observation, right? This Venezuela only had a value for one of these variables, so that's fine, ggplot. I think you did a good job anyway. So now we know that our scatter plot works, and let's go into my findings section and let's actually write something. Why don't we say, my findings show that ... How would I interpret this chart? My findings show that as GDP per capita increases, infant mortality decreases. Okay, so I'm saying that, but really what I want to do is I want to show people proof that that is the case, right? So remember, we've read in our data up here. And so why don't we go ahead and copy our ggplot code here. And since we don't have an object named viz here, why don't we just replace it with data? Because, replace it with data. Because both of these columns already exist in that data set, I don't need to change these. And why don't we knit it and see what we get? Haha. So now I've done something really interesting because I've integrated the things that I'm going to write in my report with the visualizations that I'm very fond of, right? That we are very fond of in this class, hopefully. And so I don't have to flip back and forth between Word, like I don't have to save copy and then put it into Word, which isn't that big a deal, but there are even more interesting things. So for example, why don't we just say that I want to describe the summary statistics for them. So I might say the mean infant mortality rate per 100,000 live births is... Now, one way to do that is to do what we did down here, and put it in its own chunk. But what I really want to do is just put it in the text. And I don't want to have to go through and manually calculate this, right? So what I can do is I can put these two backticks on the tilde button, and I can say, you know what, I want you to run some R code just right here, right in the line of this text. Don't put it in its own whole chunk. You don't have to do that, but evaluate whatever comes between these two things as R code. And I can say, what is the mean of data infant mortality, and ignore the NAs, remove the NAs. So I personally have not calculated this number. And why don't we go ahead and we can delete this right now. I don't want another chunk. I just want to know what the average, the mean of the infant mortality rate is. So let's go ahead and do that. I didn't manually calculate this, so now I'm typing it in. Cool. And it just evaluated that R code for me. You know what, why don't I round this number? That doesn't look very nice. So I'm just gonna put a pipe in here and I'm gonna say round, please. So let me save that and let me run it. And just like any other R code, I'm just writing R code here, right? It's 20. Yeah, great. Awesome. My findings show that as GDP per capita increases, meaning we go from 0 to 50,000 to 100,000, 150,000, etc. As this increases, infant mortality decreases, right? The mean of infant mortality rate per 100,000 live births is 20. And I didn't calculate any of that, right? I just told it, here's some R code. But there's kind of one last frustrating thing about this document, and that's that it's printing out warnings in my document itself, and I don't want that. I want that to go away. So, just as we did with echo equals false, I can write, remember, comma, and it'll pull up all of the options that I have. All the way at the bottom, you'll find one that said warning, false, because I don't want it to show me this warning right here. That's irrelevant to me. I don't really care too much. So let's go ahead and rerun that. See what happens. Nice. Very cool, right? No more warning. This is starting to come together as a proper report, which, hint, this is kind of what I'm going to want you to do for your final assignment, for your final paper in this class. I would like you to do it in R Markdown and knit it to an HTML document. So this is the basic use of R Markdown. This is kind of the power of R Markdown. And so I know in previous sections I have mentioned that I like using my own theme. And so my theme is something that I can put in this setup chunk and then call in all of my other chunks. So why don't I do that? Why don't I go to my GitHub account? So this will look pretty familiar to you. The theme, and the interesting thing about theme is that I can just save it as its own object and then call it again and again, right? So none of what's actually in here matters at all. They're just stylistic choices that I like to be a part of the plots that I make. Yours might be completely different, right? Yours might be totally different. And in that case, like I said in the last module, play around, see what you like. But what's important is that we've saved it as this object called my theme. And so what I can do is I can just say plus my theme to my ggplot argument, and let's get rid of this for a second, and then let's just reknit it and see what it comes up with. Remember, the original chart looks like this if I just run the basic ggplot, and when I run my chart, that's what it looks like. Looks a little bit nicer, I think. Awesome. And that goes a little bit better, I think, with the HTML output that we have. One last thing to keep in mind, or one last thing to know, is that, at a certain point, I'm going to be doing, or I'm going to have more than one or two chunks, right? So Control-Alt-I will add a new chunk for what it's worth. And so if every single time I have a new chunk, I have to type in echo equals false, warning equals false, message equals false. Message is the thing that R outputs when you do group by variables in dplyr, for example. That's going to get exhausting pretty quickly. What I want is I just want to set these options at the beginning of my R Markdown file. And I want to tell R Markdown, hey, every time you see a chunk, just import these settings. That's all I want you to do. I just pull these settings in, and that's it. And I don't want to type these every single time. And so you'll notice that what I can do here with the knitter package is do just that, right? It says echo equals true. Actually, I want echo equals false. So let me save that. And then why don't I take out echo equals false on all of these, right? So I've set it as a global option up here in my setup chunk, which means that every other chunk is going to adopt the same setting. And so I don't have to write echo equals false for every single one. Let's go ahead and reknit that and see what happens. Yeah, no code is showing, right? And you'll see what happens when I don't do the NARM argument for mean. So let's go ahead and do that. na.rm equals true. And let's re-knit. So every time I knit, it's taking this skeleton and it looks to see what output do you want it in. And it says, okay, let me run all of this code, all of these chunks, and then whatever the output of these chunks is, I'll put it together with whatever text it is that you want to write. And then it produces an entire document. Why don't we finish off with some other kind of text? I'll delete this because I don't think this really matters too much. Why don't we just end off with some shortcuts? So you already know how to make these section headings. These will be very useful for you. You already know how to make a numbered list, for example. And then maybe we need some other things. So I can say things to keep in mind. And these don't go in any order. So I can just put them in dashes, right? Watch for strange column names. And then the next thing on my unordered list can just be another dash. And I can say, you know, be patient. Code is frustrating. Let's say I want to italicize this. No problem. Just put it in between one pair of asterisks. Let's say I have another item and I say use Google period. Someone else has had the same problem. And let's say I want this to be bold. I can just put this in between two asterisks. So let's go ahead and knit that and see what we get. Ta-da! Here we have some italicized text. Here we have some bolded text. We have different sections. We have our plots that are directly in here, right? Maybe one last thing that I want to do is I want all of my charts to be in the middle of my output rather than left aligned. So why don't I say, comma, figure align equals center. And it has to be in these single quotes, by the way. And now my chart shows up in the middle of my whatchamacallit, right? In the middle of my document rather than left or right. I could do left or right if I wanted to. It automatically does left, but I want it in the center. So I think that looks pretty nice. And you know what? That's pretty much it. That's all we're going to cover today. So for this assignment, I think all we're going to do is, let's see, how long has it been? Yeah, why don't we call it a day today? For today's assignment, I just want you to continue working on the data that we worked with for the last lab, and I want you to put your findings into R Markdown and spend a little bit more time looking through the scholarly literature and looking for social theories that kind of explain the patterns that you found with your data last time. Last time we looked at the World Bank indicators. Today, it's time for you to be a little bit more of a political statistician, a political scientist, and delve into the politics of it. Part of that means convincing people that the patterns that you found are actually real. That's important. And so R Markdown helps with that. It helps you integrate your data and your analysis all together in what I think is a very easy sort of format to do that. So today we covered R Markdown. Yep, we did this. You know what? We're not even going to knit to PDF today. That's totally unnecessary. And we didn't even need to do this. So that was pretty good. So today we did a few things. One, we covered the YAML, right? We filled out most of these values when we first started up in R Markdown. We talked about headings. These are these two things. Ah, yes, and for what it's worth, we can also do subheadings with 3. So things to keep in mind, right? So 2 for headings, 3 for subheadings. I think it goes all the way to like 5 or 6. Right? And you can see that this one is a little bit smaller than this one. This one is big and bold. This one's a little smaller. So we have a subheading here if for whatever reason you need a subheading for your document. And you can go 4 levels deep and stuff like that too. So we did that. We did subheadings. We did numbered lists. And we did non-numbered lists. We also did italics and bolding. We did all of kind of those classic cases of things that you might want to do in word processing, no problem. Then we looked at the basics of R Markdown, or this whole thing was the basics of R Markdown. We looked at what it means to kind of knit to something, that is to take the skeleton of our document and turn it into an HTML format. I would encourage you to try and knit it to like a presentation, for example. I know I mentioned this already, but all of the presentations that you're watching in the slides were created in R Markdown. And because it's much easier to embed those plots into a slide if the slideshow itself is created in R. So go ahead and noodle around with R Markdown and see if you can get it to produce some more interesting results. And lastly, we talked about code chunks. We talked about what their use is. We also talked about inline code. That's right here between these backticks that start with R space and then kind of any arbitrary R code that we want to put in there. R will evaluate that before it knits it to the document, which is kind of a really powerful way of doing things so that we don't accidentally, for example, just fat finger whatever the mean calculation is, right? This is a much more robust way of doing that. We catch mistakes much better if we calculate things this way. So we did inline code. We looked at the alignments of our figures. Remember, fig align equals center if we wanted a nice plot right in the middle. We also looked at how to suppress warnings and messages. And the last thing we did was kind of theme, but that was from last time's message. So again, in this homework assignment, it's not going to be too difficult. It'll really be just you moving over your analysis from the last module, or from the last assignment into R Markdown and kind of expanding on some of the comments and fleshing out a section on a literature review and more or less editorializing on the patterns that you found. So as always, if you have any difficulties, please don't hesitate to reach out. But I would encourage you, as always, in this order, try these steps. 1, give it some time. Step away for a minute, step away for a few hours, step away for a day, and then come back if you're having difficulty. You'll be amazed at how much a fresh pair of eyes can help you solve a problem. If that doesn't work, reach out to each other. Ask each other for help. I don't mind you helping each other through a problem. If that doesn't work, look on Google, right? Someone else has had the same problem that you have. If that doesn't work, come to office hours. And finally, email me or the TA and we can help you out. I'm very much looking forward to seeing your reports, and I'm excited to see you all kind of turn into proper data scientists and political scientists and social analysts. So good luck. Looking forward to seeing the output of your assignments, and don't hesitate to reach out. All right, see you in the next module.